All right, Mike Snatchers, King Snatchy. He's trying to butter me up with these perks.
Hey, what's good, everyone? I'm Mike Snatchers. Today I'm going to be going over a beat I made for Baauer's first ever bot battle. If you're watching this, I know you don't need an introduction on who Baauer is, but you might not know that he's been streaming on Twitch recently. It's honestly one of the best producer streamers that I've seen. He's super engaging, super fun to watch. This past week, he hosted a beat battle for the very first time. He kind of just gave a sample, some loose guidelines, and at the end of the day, he picked mine as the winner. And I'm super thrilled about it. If you haven't heard my beat, there's a link to it in the description, so please go check it out. But I thought today I'd just give a quick breakdown of how I made it. So let's get into it. So let's start with the sample. The sample comes from an experimental vocal ensemble called Roomful of Teeth. And this group works with some pretty interesting techniques ranging from Tuvan throat singing to yodeling. Super cool group. The sample itself was pretty long, but let me just play a couple snippets of what I was working with I picked out. And this part here. So I took that last bit and used it as an introduction to the beat. I added some auto panning, repitched it. Sounds like this. Then by adding a bit of percussion for some impacts. You get a nice little 2-bar intro there. So now we can get to our main sample here. Starting with this, we can change the timing to get it to line up a bit better with our tempo here. Pitch down a bit. It works in 4/4. This is originally in 6/8. It kind of gets that triplet feel when it's working in this, but I kind of wanted a more interesting rhythm, so by playing with the warp markers a bit, I get something that's just a tad bit more interesting than just plain triplets. So you can see I've done just a slight bit of EQing on this and mixed in just a tiny bit of OTT to bring out that high end. And I found different parts of that same sample to add a bit of variation. I also took that same track, doubled it, and did some pretty aggressive EQing just to get the high parts out to get this doubling effect. Moving on to this first little bass line, I should have done this using Operator. I have no idea why I did this in Serum, but part of my workflow, I ended up just using a sub only with no oscillators in Serum, and a bit of distortion, chorus, and filtering, and ended up with something that sounds like this. So it's very bendy. You can say it has a kind of a slow attack and also a pretty high portamento over here. I made sure it's in mono using this utility, and I did a little bit of kind of volume automation, I guess you could call it, using auto pan to give a little bit of variation, swelling in and out of the bass. Now onto the drums in this first section. The meat of this is really just a loop that was made by the count, which is kind of cheating. On its own, it sounds like this. But I used some EQ to take out the low end, a little bit of saturation, glue compression to tame some of those high transients. And this was pretty mono, so I used the Haas effect and this kind of spreader rack that I've made to give it some width. From there, I just added a shaker and some Foley. And that's most of what you're hearing in that first section. I also wanted to show you the toms in this section. There's nothing too special about this little fill. But I did want to point out that I'm using this amp plugin here. And this is something I kind of felt guilty about for a while, honestly. I discovered that using this amp plugin on either this clean setting or the blues setting would really add some crunch and some high frequencies to whatever I was doing. It felt like cheating because I just didn't really know how to bring the high end out in some either instruments or percussion things. And recently I was watching a Slumberjack stream on Twitch, and they just did the same thing. They did the exact same thing, no thought about it. They're just like, oh, this is kind of a shortcut to high frequencies. And it kind of helped me realize that there's no real rules about how to use plugins like this. If you find something that works and you like how it sounds, then just roll with it. I also threw in a few cool little peacock sounds. Just a fun little effect to put on top. As we're progressing up through the build-up, I'm adding some shakers, some claps, and a few more perks that I'll go over in just a minute. Just really adding to the energy as we're building up to the drop here. Altogether, the build-up sounds like this. You can see I've grouped all the tonal things together and have thrown on this rack called Bass Clef's Easy Washout. It's a simple way to automate some auto filtering, delay, high amount of reverb and compression all into one, and gives that kind of washout effect that you heard just then. I also took this little sample of Eric Wareheim from Baauer's Planets Mad movie, saying, because it's just cool. I had to repitch it a bit to fit in the key, but I love that video. All right, moving on to the drop now. The star of the show really is this Tuvan throat singing sample that I have here. It's just sick. It sounds so cool. I didn't choose it just because it sounds cool, though. As I mentioned before, the sample comes from this group Roomful of Teeth, who uses Tuvan throat singing techniques in their music. And you can actually hear it in that intro sample. You can hear some overtones coming out above, kind of singing way up here. It sounds like I have a whistling effect above what they're singing. And that's kind of what throat singing really is about. It has that cool guttural sound, but the real goal in much of it is to get these higher overtones to come out and resonate in a cool way. The sample that I found here doesn't have a ton of those resonating higher overtones, so I thought it'd be cool to mix that in on my own, just with some cool EQing back on that original sample that I used before. So together, those two samples sound like this. You can hear it kind of just feels like it's sitting way above that, which is a really cool effect. Also, the difference between this sample that I used at the beginning and now is that this throat singing actually is kind of in a major key. You can hear it at the end. It goes up into the major third, and this original sample is in a minor key. And so I actually took little chunks of this and repitched them differently just so it feels like it's in a major key. Of course, we got a pretty big 808 here. It's a Duracell 808 using a light bit of saturation and this British Clean preset on Camel Crusher, slightly tweaked a bit. Sounds like this. It's pretty good on its own, but I also paired it with this kind of deep kick. As Kenny Beats would say, just let it rock. No need for sidechaining. The only sidechaining I did do in this whole track was to that throat singing sample, just to give it a little bit of rhythm. Now we get to start adding in some of these drum and perk loops. I started with this Travis Barker sample, which is just a really sick tom loop. Just adds a ton of character to that 808. And in fact, I actually built the 808 pattern around this sample, and that's kind of how I came up with the bass line. On top of that, I also just have a shaker. This last sample here kind of comes from my own personal crate digging collection. This was a Third World album that I found at a record store. I ripped the vinyl and found this bonus track at the end that sounds like this. That's repeated a number of times, so I just kind of repitched it, made it into my own little loop. Put everything together and you got the drop. All right, that's it for the breakdown. If there's anything that I missed or anything that you're still curious about, just let me know in the comments. All the support that I've gotten from Baauer's community has just been amazing. Watching him vibe out on stream to my music is just a dream. So thank you, Baauer, for putting this on. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I hope I can put out more like it in the future, and I'll catch you next time.
Let's run it back one more time.